let's make a start. Whose line is it anyway? It's something that has emerged based on a piece of research that I've done and an article I wrote with one of my former students. But the question has been around with me for a very long time. Basically, when I got into coaching, I came through positive psychology, through a route of well, first of all, I studied psychology. I was interested in people. And then I was really attracted to counseling and psychotherapy because it's a very close psychological relationship. I wanted to work with people in that kind of relationship. I found it really rewarding to have that kind of conversations at depth, and having that relationship with people where they trust you, they go deep, they explore really big questions. And then I kind of fell into positive psychology and got in touch with coaching and realized, well, that's a lot more me, because it doesn't have all of these regulations in place. And perhaps I was a bit of a rebel at the time, and perhaps I still am a little, but I didn't like that other people were telling me everything that I had to do in a specific way. And particularly in Germany, you had to be trained as somebody who practices psychodynamically or with CBT in order to get patients from a doctor, for example. So I was always interested in that kind of relationship, but I wanted to go beyond. But when I studied positive psychology, I realized, well, a lot of positive psychologists, they're a little bit too positive for my taste. They kind of disregard or like focus too much on the positive spectrum and a little bit almost disregard what's actually wrong with people and all the challenges that life throws at you. So from very early on, when I explored what kind of training I would do, I wanted to work across the spectrum of what people experience and what people can go through in life. So I wanted to study coaching, but an integrative approach that would combine elements of coaching and therapy. So this was back in 2010. And what I had found back then, the closest thing I had found back then was a master's in existential coaching, which to me seemed to be quite naturally integrating coaching and, big existential questions and, the anxieties and inner conflicts and dilemmas that we face as part of being human and in the world with other people. So, and then 60-70% of the literature at least was psychotherapy literature. So for me, it was quite naturally integrative. And that's why I was interested in, well, how far can you take existential coaching in particular, but coaching in general? I've been teaching at the University of East London. I've been teaching coaching there for a number of years. I was running the program in coaching psychology, the master's. And during that time, hundreds of students were asking themselves the question, how far can I take this? We had students who were struggling to decide whether they should work with a specific client, or sometimes you work with a client and they want to go to a level of depth that you perhaps feel comfortable with, but like it's just like there's alarm bells ringing that client perhaps might be depressed or perhaps might have a mental health problem. So you would want to support that client, but you wouldn't know how far you can actually take it because you don't have the training of a mental health professional. So with all of these students coming to supervision or coming to lectures and asking themselves, can I work with this client? Am I willing to? Am I able to? These questions came up, and I think they're really important. So that's why I've been looking at this for quite some time. So that's why I want to take you through, I want to, in order to explore these kind of questions about how far can we go and whether there is a line and, whose line that actually is, we need to explore a little bit about what coaching actually is. So I brought some definitions, I brought some models. We can explore some lines or whether they're perhaps gray areas. I want to talk a little bit about coaching and therapy and where the differences are specifically between those two. Coaching can cross boundaries to therapy. That could be a line, but there could also be a line to mentoring or consulting, to counseling, teaching, just being a friend. You know, so there's multiple lines, but that line particularly, I think, is important. I want to talk about ethics, and I guess all the way through we do that, but there's a section where I specifically want to draw on some ethical guidelines, and try to keep it really practical, so that you coaches out there could find some practical tools or some advice, some guidelines on how to manage that line, you know, how to not overstep your line. So if we have time, I want to introduce a few integrative approaches. Let's see how that goes. If not, I'll just mention them. And I do want to talk a little bit about supervision and best practice for coaches, because it's important that it's one of the best ways to actually make sure that these lines are not being overstepped. And a few resources and further reading are at the end. So I told you a little bit about where I'm from and why you should listen to me. Well, I've been writing about this for some time. I've been publishing a piece of research recently in the International Coaching Review on one of my students, and I have interviewed master coaches, the ICF MCCs, and explored how they perceive their role as a coach, and how they perceive when they perhaps approach a boundary to their coaching practice. I mentioned that existential coaching quite naturally crosses some of these boundaries. I published a chapter in Personal Consultancy, which was the first book on integrating coaching and counseling. So that's, by the way, a really good resource if you want to get a good overview. And the ASCTP is the Association for Integrative Coach Therapy Professionals. And if you're interested in really integrating coaching and other one-to-one practices, that'll be a really good address for you. So first, I would like to hear, and if you, like, I tended to ask lately whether you have a definition of coaching, whether you have one or two sentences that you often say, which defines your definition of coaching. And feel free to jump in here, or raise your hand. Like I would love if somebody does, and chances are perhaps you don't, but really just one or two sentences. I mean, we can all talk about coaching for 5 minutes and give people a sense for what it is and perhaps what it isn't. But like, does anybody have a definition that they can just deliver? I'd be really interested to hear that.
So I'm a fan of the ICF one. I don't know if it's the one the ICF has always used, but I noticed it recently. And where I described it as partnering with clients in a collaborative process to spark new thinking and creativity that can help them maximize their personal and professional potential. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really like that as well, because it has that partnering element.
Yes.
You know, it has that growth element.
Yes.
That forward element.
Mm-hmm. And thought-provoking. Thought-provoking,
exactly. You're working on that level where you inspire thoughts, or you provoking is interesting, you know, because it puts a very active part onto the coach, which I guess kind of sets it apart from therapy. Therapists are less known to provoke, right?
Well,
well, let's perhaps leave it for later. Are there any other definitions out there?
Hi, Yannick. I'll jump in there.
Yes, please.
I mean, I don't tend to stick to one per se, but I quite like kind of a safe and challenging environment to enable, or to collaboratively enable a client. And I kind of leave it purposely empty at that point, because I feel like the environment that they wish to pursue is not relevant really for a definition.
Yeah, I really like that enabling element, you know, because we facilitate learning, right? We empower, I hear quite often as well. They're all kind of in the same region of helping our clients grow, rather than, you know, teaching them or making them grow.
I'm not sure I have one specific way of defining it. It very much depends from client to client, but the sorts of themes that would come out again and again would be acting as a thought partner, supporting them in a sort of journey of exploration and deepening self-awareness, in the hopes that that will create the opportunity for them to make some more informed choices in the future.
Right, I really like that. You know, because that focus on making more informed choices, you know, it has that element of exploring, helping somebody think and make choices, take action going forward. Thanks for these guys. So just these three, they had certain elements in common, but they also were all quite different. And I just want to go through a bit of a range to get a bit more of a feel, but also perhaps to inspire some people to adopt some of this, but also just to kind of get your thoughts going and introduce a bandwidth of what coaching can be, because definitions of coaching vary considerably. I've heard somebody say recently, coaching is making people's lives better. You know, very simple, and he absolutely loved that definition. And part of me was thinking, yeah, but chocolate makes people's lives better, and heroin makes people's lives better, very temporarily. There's lots of that doesn't really put coaching in, like, that doesn't really put boundaries to it, right? But it captures something very essential. I've heard coaching is a powerful conversation that helps you become the best version of yourself, and some version or another of this I see a lot out there. When you read coaches' websites, or particularly coaches who are just starting out, they tend to be fairly broad to attract a range of clients. So like stepping into your full potential, or, you know, becoming your authentic self, reaching your goals and living a successful life. Very much kind of outcome focused, which is useful, and it captures some of the results that coaching brings. It doesn't quite capture coaching itself, right? Here's one that is now 25 years old. Coaching is directly concerned with the immediate improvement of performance and development of skills by a form of tutoring or instruction. You know, very much back in the sports coaching, from the sports coaching world, because that's where coaching developed from, right? So instruction and tutoring, I still see many coaches who have a very strong instructive or directive element to their work. And that's fair play, there's use to this, but just coaching has evolved. So in the beginning, because part of my training was definitely had nothing to do with a form of tutoring or instruction, but like that was my idea of what coaching was. And then there's coaching psychology, and, you know, but like if you ask 1,000 people, then most people will probably adopt the sports coaching definition of what coaching is, which this one definitely fits. So this one I like. Coaching is the art of facilitating the performance, learning, and development of another. So some of these elements you've already captured with yours. I like that it has an art in there, because, you know, it's not just skills. We can learn skills, but there's an art to coaching, you know, at the level where it just becomes more complex than just performing skills of active listening or summarizing or like relationship building skills. We have to balance and juggle so many processes as we are engaging in a coaching relationship. There's definitely a part in there that is art. Coaching is an outcome-focused activity. Now it gets a bit more detailed, which seeks to foster self-directed learning through collaborative goal setting, brainstorming, and action planning. So we have a couple of techniques in there that hint to what kind of process you would actually use within the coaching space. So gets more detailed, draws more boundaries, a bit more of a clearer line. You know, it's collaborative, it's goal setting. You would brainstorm together. You know, you wouldn't see that so much in therapy, for example. You know, action planning, focused on action. There's a clear focus on going forward, taking action, making choices. This is probably one of the most famous definitions of coaching by Sir John Whitmore. Coaching is unlocking a person's potential to maximize their own performance. It is helping them to learn, rather than teaching them. I think that really captures a lot of the essence of most coaching, is that we facilitate, we help unlock potential. We help the client to learn rather than telling them how to do things. That's why it's possible to coach people in an area of expertise that we don't know that much about, because we're creating a thinking environment and a learning environment where people can grow and learn and find their own answers rather than us having to have the answers. So you can coach and a CEO in an industry that you have no idea about, because your understanding is that every person's experience in the world, or even of their role, even if I had been a CEO, I wouldn't really know what it's like to be that particular CEO in front of me. It might be a completely different experience in their particular organization. So that captures quite a lot of it. Now gets a lot more detailed. Christian van Nieuwenburg says, coaching is a one-to-one conversation focused on the enhancement of learning and development through increasing self-awareness and a sense of personal responsibility. I hadn't heard that before. Where the coach facilitates the self-directed learning of the coachee through questioning, active listening, and appropriate challenge in a supportive and encouraging climate. So this introduces a couple of extra factors to it. That sense of taking personal responsibility. Self-directed learning we had before, but there's a couple of techniques in there: questioning, active listening, appropriate challenging, describing the environment that they're in as supportive and encouraging. So that captures quite a bit of coaching and the atmosphere that certainly I would definitely relate to, that I would like coaching to be. But the thing is that somebody who doesn't agree with this and calls himself a coach and works with clients, they're still coaching. I cannot tell a sports coach that they're not a coach. So it's a huge umbrella term. Parslow wrote a couple of years later, coaching is a process that enables learning and development to occur and thus performance to improve. So still very much focused on performance. You will have noticed there's one of his earlier that's also focused on performance. To be a successful coach requires knowledge and understanding of process, as well as a variety of styles, skills, and techniques that are appropriate to the context in which the coaching takes place. So what I like about this one is that to be a coach, it requires a variety of different styles, skills, and techniques. So we need to integrate already. And it depends on context. What kind of styles, what kind of skills we use, what kind of techniques we use depends on the context that our client is in. So we need to move. It's more fluid than just this is how you do coaching. So that's where the art comes in, to be able to tell from your knowledge and your understanding of like which process to use. For Nieuwenburg, Christian, he really he summed it up. He looked at a bunch of different coaching definitions, and the common elements he found was that it's a managed conversation, so that the coach is in charge of the process. Very often in therapy, you would just let the conversation, like let the client talk about whatever they want to talk about, whatever they bring. All of that is important. So a coaching conversation is more managed. You're more focused. You set a certain outcome for this. So you have an anchor in the future, a focus point that guides what kind of questions you ask and what you decide to focus on and what you decide not to ask. And two people again. Coaching aims to support sustainable change to behaviors or ways of thinking. So as traditionally coaching was more focused on performance and behavior, it could also be focused on ways of thinking. It could also be a change of mindset, without necessarily a change of behavior, even though that's very likely to follow a change of mindset. But sometimes I saw little action being taken by my clients, but everything had shifted. Their whole experience of the world had shifted, even though they were still in the job that I didn't like. But now it felt like a choice. So that change in mindset, I think, is important. And coaching focuses on learning and development. That's what they probably all have in common. I really like this one by Nick Bolton, founder of Animus. And it just captures so many of the things for me that are, I think, are important, in terms of my personal view of coaching. He writes, coaching is a conversation between the coach and coachee, potentially coachees, in which the coach facilitates a journey of reflective discovery decision-making, and action, the defining characteristic of which is to focus on the coachee's own choices, solutions, and agenda. So again, have that focus in on going forward, on making choices, finding solutions, on action. But also it's a reflective journey of discovery, but going forward, but can go very deep. So I really like that. Just quickly, any thoughts on this?
Yannick, would you mind sharing some of those? I mean, I remember some of those from university course, but I'd love it if you could share a few more of those. I didn't get a chance to type them down. I don't know if you.
Of course, I'll be sharing a link to the slides. I'll be uploading them, and you can all have them.
Thank you.
So yeah, don't worry about taking notes. Also, we'll be recording this, so you'll have access to that later too. Cool. I don't want to spend too much time on this. This is Jonathan Passmore's model. It's an integrative model of coaching. And as you can see at the bottom, it's aimed at improved performance at work. What's significant here is that those of you who are a little bit familiar with therapy, you will see that the outer layer of the kind of sort of pinkish purple color has empathy in it, unconditional positive regard, non-judgmental, positive self-regard, congruence. You'll see these are the core conditions for therapy by Carl Rogers. So the space that we create as part of this model, and I think many coaches will do that naturally anyway, is one where we don't judge the client. It's one where we are congruent, we are authentic, we are genuine, we show up as ourselves. But we also have a positive regard for our client. We have that belief that whatever behaviors they put to the surface, whatever they're struggling with, they're human beings, they're people, and we can relate to them in a positive way from one human being to another, regardless of what they might have done. We have a belief that even if somebody exhibits lots of behavior that we cannot condone, or that might even disgust us, or that we really don't like, we can believe that that person was born good, and that something has happened in their life that made them into the person that they are now. But we can respect them and meet them at a human level, eye to eye, and respect them as another fellow human being. That's unconditional positive regard. So within that, the coaching process works. Within that, we build a partnership, and within that, there's techniques of making the unconscious conscious, and focusing on behavior and helping the client go through a process, which then leads to more effective behavior, improved self-regard, deeper understanding of self, and stronger motivation to act. So this already includes or integrates elements of therapy. And good coaching, I believe, it almost can't help but include elements of therapy. There's quite an overlap. I like this model by Eric Dehaan, which kind of just outlines the playing field. Because if you see, there's two lines, from suggesting to exploring, and from supporting to confronting or challenging. And wherever we are with the client, at any moment, we can react to what the client says, does, or is in any of these quadrants, in anywhere between these two spectrums. Sometimes we just need to be supportive, and we just need to tune in and transmitting that feeling that, yes, you can do this, I believe in you. Sometimes we need to challenge them. Sometimes it's really, really important and really helpful that our views or our beliefs are challenged, especially if they're unhelpful views or beliefs or thoughts. It's important. Sometimes we can put something on the table for somebody to consider, where we might recommend a book, or we might tell them about a theory of well-being, or we might just have a story that is inspiring from one of the clients that we worked with previous that was in a very similar situation. Perhaps we share something from our own experience that might have helped, not in terms of you have to do this and I advise you to, but like, here's something that seems to have worked for a lot of people, or here's something that worked for me, or here's something that worked for a lot of my clients. What do you think? On the suggestive side of things. Often we would explore, we would ask questions to help the client explore their situation. And then there's any combination of these. Perhaps just take a moment to see where on this kind of playing field you feel at home. You feel you have your natural kind of home. I know I'm generally on the exploring, challenging, confronting side. That's where I feel most at home. If I wouldn't take into account the client or the context, if I wasn't working, I would probably ask explorative questions and I'd be quite challenging. But I know, and I have learned through my coach training, when it's useful to support or when some suggestion might actually be really, really helpful. So I really like this model because it allows you to move between the playing field quite fluidly within the coaching process. You're not bound to always be supportive. Even though some coaches might just naturally be super supportive and feel a bit timid to challenge, and others might be so challenging that it's difficult for them to just hold that back and just tune in and be supportive. So what's not coaching then? Where do you draw the line between coaching and other approaches to one-to-one practice? So here's a model by Farley and Stout from quite a few years, 15 years ago now. He started making sense of coaching on, again, these two spectrums of seeing the client as the expert or seeing you as the expert. If the traditional view of consultancy would be that you actually consult, you provide a solution, you assess a problem, and then provide a solution based on your expert knowledge. I think consultancy has evolved. And for example, my brother's done 10 years of business consultancy, and a lot of the times when he talked about consultancy, it was identical to me talking about coaching, especially in the assessment period where you build a relationship and you tune in and you listen very actively. And a lot of consultants would help you find your own best solutions. Because if it's your organization and you've worked in it for 10, 15, 20 years, you'll probably know more answers than somebody who's just come in from the outside. So you could also, again, asking questions, giving answers. You could see that explorative and suggestive. So it's interesting model to start making sense of this. I'm not sure if I would place coaching so predominantly on the top left. And perhaps you might have different views on that. So, yeah, somebody.
I suppose I've got a view here.
I hope so.
yeah. That I would have expected. Like, coaching is about, for me, effective coaching is about flexibility and serving what the client both needs for their agenda, their objectives, their goals, what they have the capacity for in the moment. Mm-hmm. And fundamentally, what you've agreed
yes.
in the moment, right?
Yes,
so I would expect the bubble.
Contract.
So I'd probably expect the bubble to be one of the biggest bubbles.
Yeah, so maybe more like this.
Yeah.
So this is what I took. I took his model and then just kind of tried to make a little bit more sense of it. Now I look at it and I cringe a little bit because there's so much wrong with this from my own point of view already. Just like having a friend completely being inside there. But like, yeah, I mean, I can see it makes sense on certain degrees, but it's really difficult to put this into a model, right? So this is certainly, a work in progress. And I would encourage everybody to make their own map, and this might look like that. It might have certain elements of more consulting in there or more training, maybe counseling is right in there. Maybe it's more like this, maybe it's a little bit of training because that's the kind of coach you are. Maybe there's a lot of mentoring in it because that's the kind of coach you are and you're working with clients that work in your area of expertise. So you actually have a lot of experience that you could share, and a lot of coaches do. Maybe psychotherapy is completely outside of this. I think psychiatry probably most likely is, but perhaps some psychiatrists would also use coaching elements in their work. So really there's no one answer to this. It's really about you making that map so that you can explain, first of all, to yourself where you think coaching is and where you would draw that line. And perhaps it's a huge blurry gray area, and that's always very difficult to put into a model. I'm going to skip this one, but you can go back to it later. This is also from Dehan's relational coaching book. just kind of pointing out where he sees that kind of overlap. It just gives you a bit of information, but I think you got the point, you know. I think what it adds here is the deep interventions and surface interventions. So where expert advice often is a surface intervention, and therapy tends to be a more deeper intervention. But I leave that at that. I think the points come across. A good starting point, I find, and again, this is difficult to put out there individually, but I think as a whole slide, it does serve to start thinking about where your boundary is, you know, because you could think very often coaching is described in terms of the clients that you work with. You know, coaches work with clients who are already resourceful and whole, whereas most therapists would work with people who are actively suffering, you know, who tend to be broken and not whole. You know, most people go to see a therapist when they have a real problem, you know, they can't cope anymore and they need to see somebody, you know, they need to fix that. A lot of people come to coaches because they want to grow, they want to develop, you know, they have a goal, but if they don't go see a coach, you know, nothing's really going to happen. It's not that they're going to suffer. So not necessarily many people see a therapist because they want to go on a journey of self-exploration. Especially in the States, there's a lot less stigma attached to therapy. So it seems that everybody and their mom have a therapist. But like, it's a good starting point to think about it. Certainly not true for every coach and every therapist. The second one could be time, you know, that coaches tend to mainly work with the present and the future, whereas therapists would most often explore your past at quite some depth and how it affects your present. You know, it doesn't mean that there is no therapist out there who would also help you to go forward and make some decisions. You know, there's therapists who help you prepare for a job interview if that would really help your therapeutic process. You know, and again, like I find myself as a coach often listening to where somebody has come from. What made you the person that you are now? You know, tell me a bit about your parents. That can be a really, really useful exploration. But again, if we do that, then the lines become blurry. So it's not a rule that needs to be followed. There's certainly a lot of therapists and coaches who work vice versa. It's a useful starting point. Same with the focus and depth. Whereas coaching is sometimes said to have that focus on action, on results, on performance, on kind of surface level change. Whereas therapy has that sense of that transformation as a focus, that deep exploration of self, you know, that helping somebody through a big crisis. Often people through therapy become different people. Doesn't mean that coaching, for example, can't help somebody become a completely new person. You know, often coaching has that kind of result that you change. You know, you learn something about yourself. You go into quite some depth. Many coaches go into quite some depth. You know, but it's, again, together, all three of these elements probably derive a good starting point to start thinking about where those lines might be.
Yannick, if I may, there's just one thing I'd observe, which is that very often there isn't the clarity of which side of the line, you know, your client sits. So if I think about, you know, I've got a particular coaching client in mind who would present as entirely resourceful and whole. But then as you peel away the layers and start to work deeper and deeper, you know, and identify particular triggers, you know, there can be an aspect of them that is broken and suffering. And quite often that then can take you back into the past as opposed to being present and future oriented. I guess for me, that's a classic line, a classic boundary point. But I don't see it as being purely therapeutically the place to go. I think there are possibilities of bringing that into your coaching as long as you understand where your capability boundaries are.
Yes, I think so too. It's difficult to pinpoint them, right? To be really clear and put your finger on it, because, like, I mean, I had one coach that I talked to, and they're like, well, when the client starts crying, I refer them to a therapist. You know, and I'm like, oh, wow. That's a pretty clear line. But like, what if they're, I don't know, what if they're crying of laughter, or like, you know, what if they just had a really, really shitty day, and usually they're really composed and they do amazing work.
Or what if they're crying because actually there's been a breakthrough at that moment for them, which has been so astonishing that actually there's huge emotion attached to it.
Exactly. Yes. So
Yeah.
I'm like, well, you're making it too easy for yourself. But like, we like clear boundaries, right? It gives us certainty. It's more complex when it's a gray area. It's more complex when we have to make decisions every time something happens. You know, we long for clear frameworks. You know, that's why we put them out there, and we put models and we put guidelines and rules, you know, of what you're supposed and not supposed to do. I mean, some of them are pretty clear, like, well, don't have sex with your clients. That's pretty clear rule for, I think, everybody who works professionally with somebody. But like, beyond that, there's so many of these rules that just can't have a clear boundary. So it's difficult to navigate that kind of space.
Can I jump in here for a moment?
Please.
Because I remember that there has been a study, I think it's 2012, Susie Green, and some other people. Unfortunately, I don't remember exactly, but they were speaking about this aspect of resourceful and whole.
Mm-hmm.
And the numbers were like about 10% of the population seems to be resourceful, psychologically fit, and whole, while about 52%, if I remember well, were people who were functioning, were resourceful, but they were struggling with issues, with challenges.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was another 20% that required therapy, that had more serious problems that had to be addressed with specialist treatment. And then there was another 10% that were where all the disorders, the more serious, the very serious disorders were grouped. So her point was that our responsibility as coaches is to move people from one level to the other, the 52% to the 10%, but basically that most people, the point was that most people are not completely functioning, are not completely whole and well.
Absolutely. I mean, who's perfectly whole, right? I mean, everybody's got issues.
Exactly.
Some have severe stuff going on and really difficult, painful histories as human beings. Some are managing and coping better, and others are not. But we all have our little things going on. We all have our little tics, and we all are a bit narcissistic, and like, everybody's got their stuff. And where's the line between normal and disorder? And I guess I've always been a little uncomfortable with, for example, well, here's a statistical manual like the DSM for here are the tick boxes. You need to tick all of these boxes, or 6 out of 10 boxes, and then you can be diagnosed with a certain disorder. You know, as an existentialist, I don't quite believe in disorder as such, but just as in very different experiences of being human. And then it becomes really difficult to draw a line and saying, okay, now you're sick and you need fixing, you know, or at this point, now you're normal and you can stop therapy and start with a coach if you want to go further. So for me, it's very clear to me that there is a big gray area that we need to navigate. You know, there's a big uncertain sea out there, and when we go in there, then it's going to be complex, and we're not quite going to know. We don't have like very clear boundaries. We just need to navigate it and go a lot on instinct. But some coaches, they put very clear boundaries, and they say, look, I only work with performance, and we're going to work with behavior change. And if you want to talk about your marriage, then I'm not the person, you know. And I respect that, because they can do a lot of really focused work on your behavior. I think on overall, you're probably missing out if you want to see the person as a whole. You know, you can probably do more powerful work. But also, if you've had a weekend or 5 weekends of training and only a little bit of experience, you know, I think you probably shouldn't take on somebody with a huge amount of stuff and baggage and, you know, like having struggling to cope and manage all of that anxiety that they carry from their childhood or certain traumatic experiences. So I think every coach needs to know, every practitioner needs to know what they're willing to do and what they're able to do.
Yannick, I agree with that point, that last point especially, but I think that inevitably clients don't often present like that.
Yeah.
And things emerge as the conversation evolves. So I think that it might not necessarily be a case of seeing a client and going, okay, we've got loads more stuff that's way beyond my capabilities here. It's more, I think the challenge for a coach is probably more as things emerge, how do we then kind of process it? I was comfortable like coaching this individual last week or last time, but now we're sort of going into sort of muddier waters. I think that's a tension that coaches kind of, should at least be grappling with.
Yeah, I think so too. And you need to meet the client where they are, and you need to take session by session, right? That's why I think good contracting is really important. What have we agreed to work on? And are we still working on that? And also the obstacle that we've discovered between you and your goal, between where you are now and where you want to be. Am I willing and able to resolve that obstacle or work on it? Sometimes you identify certain obstacles and you just know that this is beyond my competency as a coach. I remember one of my first coaching clients while I was still in training, 3 sessions in, we discovered that what was really in the way of her reading faster to be able to manage her course better, she was studying at the time, was a 20-year miscommunication pattern with her husband and a really difficult family situation at home. And at that point, I knew, look, if you want to resolve that, if you want to work on that, I'm not going to be the right person for you. You're going to get a much better service from somebody else, and I'm happy to refer you to one of my colleagues. So I think you need to contract in the beginning, try to put a frame around what your coaching space is and isn't, whatever that may be. And then going forward, you need to recontract depending on what surfaces. You cannot know, as you say, you cannot know what's going to happen during the coaching in the beginning because people don't present their inner, like their deep inside feelings and their traumas and who they really are. They don't reveal that immediately. So that's why it's so important to keep asking yourself those questions. And that's something we're going to talk a little bit later as well. So thanks for that. Just a couple of quotes just to show, well, it's an ongoing question. In my master's in existential coaching, we kept talking about it from the very first day to the very last day. And still, when I meet some of my old colleagues, that we still talk about when therapy begins and coaching stops or something else begins. Some coaching and counseling definitions are very similar. Williams and Irving wrote, coaching looks like couching. That's a good one. Coaching looks like counseling in disguise, without the stigma, but also without the ethics. Coaching is a different brand name for counseling work. Also keep in mind that counseling in the States is different than counseling in the UK, for example. In the UK, most textbooks, for example, use counseling and psychotherapy interchangeably. Whereas in the US, for example, counseling requires a lot less training and they actually give some counsel. So there's a big difference there. Bakarova and Cox write, we see coaching as an ally for counseling in the process of improving well-being. And I really like that last one. A good coach may be constantly switching between coaching and counseling during a single session. I talk about my different professional hats. I have a coaching hat. I have a training hat. I have a tutoring hat. I have a mentoring hat. I have a bit of a counseling hat because a lot of my training went so deep inside that realm. So how do I manage all of these hats and which ones to use? At the point that you're giving advice, I don't think you're coaching, but you can still give some advice under the umbrella of coaching. So, how to manage the different roles that you have, the different hats that you can wear. And which ones of those hats are there? Because not everybody has a training hat. Not everybody has an expert hat, depending on what they want to work on. So I think that's important to know what your playing field is, which hats do you have, and then be able to tell that client what you can and what you cannot do with them. This is nice. My colleague and friend Nesh Popovich tends to put these pictures up when he talks about integration of coaching and counseling. Because is there a demarcation line? Is there a line between coaching and counseling? Do you at some point stop coaching and then you use counseling skills and then you go back to coaching? You know, kind of like a tequila. I've married a Mexican, so I know that this is not the way you drink tequila, but it is for many people. You know, you first have the salt, and then you drink the tequila, and then you bite into the lemon. You know, one after the other, clear steps. Whereas a gin tonic is you mix it all together and you stir it. You know, it's kind of all integrated. So Nash and I are still discussing this. You know, for him, there's a line, and I think there's a big gray area, and that's fine. You know, you can think about how you do things. You know, to some clients, you might say, well, today we're going to do this session, or let me put my such and such hat on for a minute. You know, but you could also explain what the process of your coaching is, and which elements there are, and then they know that you might switch between hats fluidly without necessarily recontracting whether that's okay. Nash also talked about counseling more as building a strong foundation, but without the house on top. And coaching oftentimes has a beautiful house, but lacks a strong foundation. You know, that's why a lot of coaching that I see is quite temporary, and then people go back to the coach because they haven't quite dealt with the underlying issues that led to that kind of behavior. You know, I often describe when there is a barrier, an obstacle between point A and point B. You know, what do? Coaches often go around or jump over or like go to a different B. They find a way to go around, or like counselors, they want to resolve, they want to dissolve the barrier so that you can go smoothly. So again, it's not necessarily for all practitioners, but I think it's a useful way to look at it. So the question here then is ethics, and I love talking about these things because it's not really a set of rules or a fixed framework. These are not steps that you have to follow. You know, even ethical frameworks, they're not necessarily rules that you have to follow. I think they're an ongoing process of reflection, of asking yourself questions. You know, of asking yourself whether I'm willing and whether I'm able to work with this client in front of me. You know, and it's important to consider a couple of elements there that help you to decide whether you've overstepped your line or not. And notice how I switched to your line rather than the line or a line. Because there's codes of ethics. You know, there's certain guidelines of the International Coaching Federation, the Association for Coaching, the European Mentoring and Coaching Council. You know, there's every coaching body, every official coaching body will have a frame of ethics, a framework that gives you certain guidelines. And some of them are more and some of them are less vague. Some of them are incredibly vague. But they give you a starting point of how to think about this. Is it okay to work in this way? You know, then there's certain rules. There's the law of the land. You know, there's certain things that are simply illegal. In the United States, you have to report clients at a certain point. You have to break confidentiality when you, for example, have any suspicion of terrorism. You know, you have to report your clients. I think it's a moral obligation to, when somebody's at risk of harm, if somebody tells you, after the session, I'm going to go home and I'm going to kill myself. You know, I think you have an obligation as a coach to step in and do something about that. And if you can't do that with a client and they're adamant that they're going to kill themselves, are you going to call the police? You know, are you going to call an ambulance and send it there? You know, are you going to break confidentiality and give that client's home address away if you have it? You know, are you going to try to call family members of them? And like, this is difficult decisions, but like there's some rules, there's some laws, there's some guidelines. Lots of coaches don't really think about that. Obviously, you wouldn't want to be in that situation, but I've been in situations where suicidal thoughts surfaced with somebody who seemed to be clearly a coaching client and quite resourceful and whole at first. You know, there's your own values, your own belief system. You know, somebody might argue that, hey, look, if somebody wants to kill themselves, then so be it. That's their choice. Who am I to judge that they shouldn't do it? Who am I to intervene in my client having made a decision? You know, it's my obligation to challenge that and to make sure that that's really what they want. But if they then decide to do so, who am I to stop them? You know, I'm not going to interfere with what my client chose, because I just used the whole coaching process to help them find their own answers, and that was their answer. You know, so what are your own beliefs around this? Of course, I mean, I'm triggering lots of people out there probably, because many people think very differently about that. And that's important, you know, but I also know people who believe that. So, but then also, what are your own assumptions about this? You know, what a coach should and shouldn't do is something that you need to decide for yourself. So my assumption about coaching is that it's mainly facilitating learning, while somebody else's assumption about coaching might be my idea of mentoring. You know, I've worked with a coach who turned out not to be a coach. You know, he was a mentor. And like that was weird, because we hadn't really had that conversation to that point. You know, I thought I was going to receive a lot more coaching, but instead he was just like making lots of suggestions about what I could be doing. You know, and some of them are incredibly helpful, and I got a ton of value from it. But like, that wasn't coaching in my books, but it definitely was coaching in his books. So again, there's no regulation officially by any country. There's a couple of coaching bodies trying to regulate what coaching is and isn't. But again, even their definitions are fairly broad, and you can fit a lot of stuff in. You know, morally, well, what's your idea of right and wrong here? If somebody shows or shares something that is that rings your depression bells, but you have a feeling that if you refer them to the therapist, they would never go there, because you've just spent so much time building a trusting, confidential relationship where that person feels safe. And perhaps you know that they might not feel safe with a counselor or building a new relationship. And you feel that it's really important that they got some support. So better with you with very limited skills than with nobody at all. So what do you do then? You know, do you keep working with somebody even though you feel out of your depth? You know, you can't really help them with their depression, but like you feel you should be there for them? Are you still coaching them? So these are all questions that I think you need to ask yourself, followed by some very honest and some critical evaluation of the answers. You know, because we tend to jump to our own conclusions. We have made sense of coaching once, and now we just kind of trying to roll through that model. And if something doesn't quite fit in, we're often quick to jump to explanations. So we need to keep asking ourselves these questions. You know, we need to keep reflecting on, how did that session go? You know, what was going on there? Maybe there's something I've missed, or, you know, did I feel uncomfortable, or did I feel too comfortable? You know, I often have coaches coming to supervision and they're like, I don't know what to bring. Everything went really well. And I'm not really like, there's nothing that went wrong or caused me any trouble. I had no challenges with my clients this week or this month. And then we start exploring just any session, and all of a sudden the most profound learning comes out of this. You know, so sometimes just taking the time, I think too few coaches are taking the time after the session to really think about what was going on there, what were some critical moments. You know, if you take notes afterwards, I always take 5 or 10 minutes of notes after the session, and just like jot down what was going through my mind, not just like what we talked about in terms of process or logistics, but also how did I feel at certain moments, or what was my sense, what was my assumption. You know, maybe then through that reflection, there's something that might come up that I want to take to supervision, or that I want to get back to the client with. You know, so I think this is really important, that we're not just honest with ourselves and taking the time, but that we're critical about it. Which brings us to supervision, because I put this as supervision is somewhere between do yourself a favor and go work with a supervisor, because it is so valuable. Think about supervision as coaching specifically focused on your work with clients. You know, there's a ton of value. Nobody needs a coach. Everybody should want one. And I think it's the same with supervision. And some coaches work with clients in such a close psychological contact, and the clients might perhaps be a bit more on the vulnerable side. And I think if your clients are somewhat vulnerable, you absolutely should have a supervisor. And I always say, look, any form of reflection is going to be good for you. If you take some notes after the session, that's good. Reflect. If you think about a client or a session, how it went under the shower, then that's good. It's going to help you. If you talk with a random stranger about that client that you've been seeing, confidentially, obviously, then, that's better because you get that conversational space and you hear yourself talk. If you do that with a couple of peers, with a peer group or in a training room, that's even better because they understand coaching and they know you fairly well. That's even better. But the best way to get that kind of value and to reflect and be challenged is a professional supervisor. It's similar, like, yes, if you have a chat with your friend about a problem that you're having, it's going to be really useful. Well, depending on the friend. But if you talk to a professional coach about the problem that you're having, that's going to supersize the results that you're getting from it. And it's the same with supervision. Any reflection is good, but if you want to go to the top of supervision, work with somebody who's trained and not just somebody who's done coaching for quite a while and calls himself a supervisor now. I see so many supervisors give their own advice and tell them their own experience. And I see so many coaches who try to model the approach of their supervisor, who are seeking out supervisors who they'd like to be. And I think that's dangerous. And a trained supervisor will know how to manage these kind of relationships. So, yeah, I think there's a certain ladder. Anything is useful, but if you want to be the best coach you can be, I think there's no way around supervision. So again, this came up a couple of times. Ask yourself, what's best for my client? Ask yourself, am I willing to work with this client? And am I able to work with this client? And what's best for my client is not often an easy answer. As I said, sometimes that client opens something up and you feel a little bit uncomfortable working with it, but you also know there's nobody else that could hold that space. And I found myself saying to a client, it's like, hey, look, that they had somebody that they knew died. And the session was already planned and we had been working for quite some time. So we'd know each other really well. And when he came to the session, he said the situation. It's like, look, 2 hours ago, I found out that this has happened, and it was too late to cancel. I didn't want to cancel. So I don't know, here I am, but I don't know what to do with this space, because well, this is not coaching. And we both agreed that this wasn't going to be coaching, but I offered to just listen. I didn't want to intervene in any way because I don't work with bereavement. I think it's a really, really difficult thing to work with bereavement, but I could certainly offer a space where I just listen and I'm just being with that client and offering some support, not in a sense of me doing something about it or us doing something or resolving an issue or taking action or making decisions, but just being there as a fellow human being. I don't think that was certainly not coaching for me, but we had a really useful time where that person could just kind of voice some of the stuff and feel some of that pain. And I wouldn't want to work like that all the time because I don't like, it's really difficult to be in a space that has that heaviness to it, the weight of somebody's emotion. It's not how I choose to work. I probably I would want some more training, but I'm not willing to do that. I know some of the people who trained me, they have a psychotherapy background and really good training, but they decided to not work with therapeutic clients anymore. One of those does only work in organizations now because he's just not interested in doing therapeutic work anymore. He's very capable of doing it. He just doesn't want to, and the other way around. I see so many coaches who are really willing to work with somebody who suffers from depression or suffers from depression is difficult, but who is in the range of, somebody who might be facing a clinical diagnosis of depression. They really want to help, but perhaps somebody else would be much better to help them. I saw in a group recently that somebody had finished a training as a bereavement coach, specializing in working with mothers who lost their children. And my first thought was, oh my God, I really hope this is in parallel to therapy, because imagine somebody who works with a coach because they don't want to go see a therapist. And then that coach with very limited training tries to help you through a process of grief. I don't think that's coaching. I think coaching has something to offer for somebody to somebody who's suffering like that. But I wouldn't want to take the opportunity away to work with somebody who's trained to do this work, to hold that kind of space and guide somebody through such a process. I think they need more training than a couple of weekends and reading a few books. That's why many therapists, depending on the country, most therapists have years and years and years of training. 6-8 years. That's a lot of books. That's a lot of training. That's 400 hours of placement supervised. You really, really get to know yourself and what your trigger points are, so that you can work with somebody most effectively, especially when they're very, very vulnerable. As soon as a client is very vulnerable, you're treading dangerous water. You really need to ask yourself those questions. Am I willing and am I able to work with this client? And you need to be critical and honest with the answers that come up for you. So I said there was no rules, but I struggled to find a better title for the slide. So here's my rules for ethical conduct. First of all, good contracting. I mentioned that it's important to frame your space, to put as best a line around it as possible. There will be lines drawn in the sand. There will be gray areas, but find a way to talk about boundaries, even if you don't know where they are. Whenever I work with clients, I tend to say, hey, look, there are boundaries to coaching and what I can do, what I'm competent in. I never know what's going to come up. I don't anticipate it, but some people, they identify some sort of trauma that's coming from their past, which I might or might not be able to help you with, depending on the severity of that. Sometimes there was a session, there was the 6th session that I worked with a client, and I found out he got so severely bullied, it really, really, really traumatized him. And all of a sudden, it became so clear what he was struggling with in terms of taking action, and we had done all the coaching stuff. And at that point, it was clear there was a boundary. I cannot give any guarantees that I can help somebody reach their goals, because we don't know what we uncover through that process of exploration. So good contracting is mandatory or crucial to good work, because it allows you to, when that point comes, when you feel out of your depth, it's much easier to say, hey, remember that in the beginning, that when I said that there is a certain line and I don't know where it is exactly, but if I overstep it, I know. I think we just overstepped it because I have that feeling in my gut. And like, if you wanted to explore what we started to explore in more depth, then I would recommend you speak to one of my colleagues who specializes in that kind of thing. And if you want to keep on working on this other area that we can do really good coaching work with, then we can do that. But I'm also happy to pause the coaching, you work with somebody else, and then we pick it up from where we left it. So saying that there is a boundary, even though you don't know where it is exactly, is really, really helpful. And there's also contracting in terms of how far does confidentiality go, for example. Like I've heard some coaches say, everything you say is 100% confidential. I don't think that's true, but like, if you say that, you gotta stick to it. If you say everything you say is 100% confidential, and I respect your confidentiality 100%, and then they say something like, I'm gonna go home and kill myself, and you're not okay with that, then you need to break your promise. That's not okay, ethically, I think. So, it's not 100% confidential unless you really, really mean that. Informed consent is based on that. I always, like, at some point I made my peace with the coaches who practice in a way that I don't agree with. Because it doesn't matter what you call yourself. What matters is that you are able to explain to a potential client the way that you work and the kind of work that you do, and you process as best as you can. And you put the framework out there, you paint the picture of what your coaching space is and isn't. And on the basis of that, your client needs to give you permission to work with them. If you say we do performance coaching, and then you use all of these counseling skills and you ask these NLP questions that go to the deepest core of their being and makes them feel really vulnerable, then that's not okay. They didn't give you permission to work with them in that way. You know, so I think the ethical way is that your client is able to give you informed consent. If your client is so bereaved that they can barely hear what you're saying or grasp, you know, what you're trying to explain to them, they cannot give you informed consent. If you work with a 6-year-old, they probably cannot really give you informed consent if you explain what coaching is. If you come with a definition, you cannot expect them to understand that. So it's really important that your client gives you permission to work with you based on how you explain what your coaching is. You know, and if you say, I'm a coach, and you describe the work of a therapist, and your client says, on that basis, I'm willing to work with you, it doesn't matter what you call it. They gave you permission to work with it. You know, I know some people who do deep coaching or spiritual coaching. I know somebody who told me that their first coach helped them through their trauma of feeling like they shouldn't have been born. You know, they had survived an abortion, like that their mother tried to abort the pregnancy and it didn't work. So they were born anyway. And that had huge effects on that person's experience of being in the world, you know, and then a coach helped her through that trauma, you know, going through all of her childhood. And I'm like, that wasn't coaching, but it was clearly super, super, super helpful because it really helped that person transform and like themselves and engage in life. You know, it had a huge impact. But like, I wonder what the contracting was like back then, because I would expect that coach to say, we might do some very deep work and we might go way into your past and I'm going to help you to work through some of your shit. You know, I think that's important. So informed consent, knowing your boundaries, you know, having thought about how far you can go, having done enough work on yourself and with clients or practice clients in safe triads to know where you feel comfortable and where you are competent, you know, willing and able, you know, willingness and ability, know where your boundaries are, or at least know how it feels like when you approach them or overstep them. You know, that's important. So you need to stay mindful and you need to listen to your inner voice. You need to listen to your intuition and then not always follow blindly your intuition, but take it as information. If you feel something, you feel uncomfortable, take that time to reflect, take that time with a supervisor, even in the session, take a moment as a timeout, listen to that voice inside of you and then evaluate it critically. Am I still doing the right thing here? Is this still ethical? Is it still moral? Is it still within the rules? You know, is it against the law? And then know these signs and have the courage to refer a client if needed, or to just stop the work. You know, you don't have to take on any client. You don't need to work with anybody. You know, you can say, I don't want to work with you anymore. And yes, that might break the relationship and it might be difficult. Don't do it if a client is super, super vulnerable, but I think you shouldn't work with those people anyway. But like, have the courage to refer. And when you refer, train and find the language to not make that sound like you failed as a client or I don't like you, I don't want to work with you. But hey, the best thing for you right now is to not work with me, but with somebody else. You know, you're on their side and you're so much on their side, you're willing to sacrifice them as a client so that they get a better service elsewhere. You know, and if you phrase it that way, it comes from a position of support. It doesn't come off a position of abandonment. So I mentioned notes and reflection. It's really, really important, I think. If you take notes or not during the session, many people don't take notes so that they're more present. But I think especially if you work with more and more clients, if you see 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 clients a day, it's impossible to remember all of these moments. So I think if you want to work supervision effectively, if you want to use it effectively, I think it's crucial to take some notes, take some time to reflect after sessions, note down those questions, capture those moments and the thoughts that were going through your head, and bring that into the supervision space or into your group. And yes, regular supervision, I think, is a golden rule for ethical conduct, depending on what clients you work with. Like I said, for some, they absolutely should. Others, it's a nice to have. What time is it? Oh, wow, that went quickly. So there's not many. Personal Consultancy is a really, really good book to read around this subject. It's the first one that got published. Really combining counseling and coaching in a meaningful way in the model. It's the first book on the subject. And there's a course at the University of East London, here in London, which is a postgraduate master's, where you can learn coaching and counseling and how to put it together. I wish that course existed when I was studying it, because I would have done it. But like, there are courses now that are integrative. I mentioned existential coaching, bridging some of these boundaries, going further, just because of the nature of the existential questions. It's going further into the therapy realm, further into depth than any other coaching approaches that I know. That's my book. Got to pitch it. Buy it. It's great. And Rocket Supervision, my approach to supervision, I mentioned my hats, and that approach allowed me to put my different hats together, paint that picture, and decide when I use what hat. There is others, but I mean, there's so many names out there, and you can't tell it from a name. Deep coaching, trauma coaching, bereavement coaching, addiction coaching, spiritual coaching, integrative coaching, or just life coaching. You know, all of these, under all of these headings, I see coaches going into a tremendous amount of depth with clients, really help them transform at quite a core level, just because they have that conversational space that is only focused on them. You know, and if as a coach, you're really good with relationships and you're willing and able to hold emotional space, your clients can really go through quite a transformation. And at some points, it'll be indistinguishable from therapy. If you were to take 5 minutes out of a session and film it and show it to somebody, you wouldn't know if it's therapy or coaching. You know, so it's really difficult to put a frame around these things, because there is no accepted frameworks. And part of the beauty of coaching is that there is no regulation. There's also danger around this and risk around this, because you have people with very little training doing very deep psychological work. And I think sometimes that can be really, really dangerous. So that's why I'm putting the word out there and having these webinars, so that people can start critically evaluating who they're working and how they're working. And perhaps you might want to go gain some more training so that your clients are safer, you know, because the problem is, if somebody is very, very confident in their practice and in their work, perhaps overly confident, you know, and sometimes I see coaches being so confident in the help that they're providing that they might not see the risks for the client or how vulnerable somebody is, or with a question that you ask, you can really pierce something, you know, one question and you can pull somebody's rug underneath their feet and their value system, and they might fall for a long time. Are you able to handle that space that follows? You know, that's important questions. That said, tons of coaches do tremendously amazing work, but it is important to me that our clients are safe, and not every coach can perhaps make that judgment for themselves, hence supervision. There's a bunch of resources in here. There's more. There's not many books. These are really the only 2 books I found on the subject. If you know any more, you come across others, do let me know. These are from 2013 and 2015, particularly around integrating counseling and coaching, and where that boundary might be. There's a couple of articles that I put in there. One I wrote myself, and yeah, that just for completion, for you to dig a little bit further. And with that, how to get a supervisor, I just put that out there because some coaches told me they don't know how to get one. Well, you could Google it. You could reach out to your school or training provider. They will definitely, or well, hopefully, be connected to some supervisors or working with a couple, or at least be able to refer you to one. The ICF, the AC, probably other coaching bodies have supervisors. There are search functions on these couple of websites. The Coaching Supervision Academy is great. I know a couple of people are teaching there. They have a list of their own supervisors who have certified. And of course, my own website, where you can look for supervision in groups or for individuals one-on-one. Have a little look if you feel that would be helpful. Any form of supervision is good. Find a supervisor. I don't care if you work with me or somebody else. Find a supervisor. It'll be really good for you and your clients. And with that, yes, let's stay in touch. Do reach out. My doors are almost always open. And I'd love to hear from you, is what I usually say. There's a couple of places where you can learn a bit more about what I provide and the coaching stuff that I do. I do write some monthly nuggets. If you wanted to come on my mailing list, just go to my website, existential.coach. You can sign up there. And with that, I say thank you, and looking forward to a bit of conversation now afterwards. I'm happy to stick around a little bit longer. I do have a meeting in half an hour, but I'm very happy to stick around 15 minutes longer so we can actually talk a little bit. Sorry, I went a little bit over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Could I, Yannick, could I add one recommendation on the book front?
Of course.
One that I found really helpful that was published, I think it was the back end of last year, if you're working with leaders. It's called A Coaching Guide for Working with Leaders. Where did you learn to behave like that? And it's really very much about how people's childhood formative experiences play out in their leadership when they're under pressure. It's by a lady called Sarah Hill.
Great.
And I found it really thought-provoking and helpful.
The Coaching Guide to Working with Leaders?
Yeah, so the main title is Where Did You Learn to Behave Like That?
Right.
By Sarah Hill.
Sarah Hill.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. What made you think of that right now?
It was, so much of the conversation actually it came to mind because I guess I have a particular client in mind that I've worked with in recent months where I absolutely reached one of what I would call a sort of oh shit moment, which, you know, for me is, you know, a sign, it kind of gets my radar up to, okay, I think I'm close to my boundaries now. Am I outside of my boundaries? How am I going to manage this? And I just happened, I don't know if the book found me rather than I found the book, but, you know, in that moment of, can I continue with this client? Is this sufficiently in my boundaries? And between that and working with my supervisor, actually, I found that there was a way that I could support an aspect of that client's needs. I couldn't possibly go back and unravel their whole childhood story, and that of itself was a much bigger piece of work. But I could find a way to support them sufficiently that we could continue with the challenge that they were trying to deal with at that moment in time. And certainly reading the book was helpful for me in that. I think there is some more detailed training behind the piece, which is certainly something I would consider for the future.
Right, thank you so much. And guys, what other thoughts, ideas, questions, anything we can clarify, anything that's come up for you? I know the chat has been reasonably active. I obviously didn't really have an opportunity to go through. If there's questions in there that you wanted to bring up, would love to know a little bit about what was going on for you.
I just want to say thank you, Yannick. I've got to jump off to another meeting. Really thought-provoking, and can second that book recommendation. And if anyone does get to the bottom of this paper that someone mentioned by Susie Green about the relative proportions of the population that present as resourceful or whole, but who actually have kind of unresolved stuff that's really stopping them from functioning.
We'll look it up and send it to Yannick.
Fantastic. Yeah,
awesome.
Thank you. Please do. Okay, bye for now.
Bye, Joe. Thank you for joining.
Thanks.
And thanks, Imola.
Yes, bye.
Other voices, comments, conclusions?
This is Lisa. I'm actually not a coach quite. I'm a teacher of the Alexander technique, which is slightly different. But it was an interesting.
I hadn't heard about that.
Haven't you? No.
No.
It's a way of, it's a way of looking at what habits we have and how we can change them. But it starts by very much looking at a physical relationship of the head and spine. But just to say, the other thing is I'm doing a positive psychology course at New Bucks from
great.
September.
With Matthew.
So, yes, that's right. So I'm really interested in the link between the mind and the body and how they affect one another, basically. So, yeah, but it's lovely to hear what you said. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. You are very welcome.
Yeah, I'd echo that. Thank you so much, Yannick. I've written reams of questions to continue posing to myself, many of which don't have easy answers at the moment. So that of itself means that I've got huge value out of the webinar. So thank you. Really appreciate your time.
You're very welcome. We could, if you wanted to stick around for a minute, I'm happy to export the slides, upload them, and send you a link to the PDF. Otherwise, I would send them to. Have you all registered via the Salisbury coaching website or via the Eventbrite?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Somebody joined directly, or? Okay, that's great, because then I can also just send it to Ross and he'll send you an email afterwards.
Cool.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, happy to do it that way, yeah.
Cool. So I'll just do that now and say goodbye for those of people who jump off. If you do want to stick around, please do. It'll take me probably around 2 minutes to just export the slides and paste the link, and then I'll also send it to Ross. So if you need to jump to another meeting, please do.
Great.
Thank you very much for
Thanks,
your
Yannick.
attention,
Cheers.
Thanks, Yannick.
and yeah, hope to see you guys soon.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.